Inside the private hangar at Miami Executive Airport, a Gulfstream G650 sat fueled and ready, its engines silent, waiting. CEO Charles Verrett paced beside the aircraft in his Tom Ford suit, barking orders at his assistant, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. He needed to fly now. A $2.8 billion merger depended on it. His assistant frantically worked her phone, calling every backup pilot in South Florida. All unavailable. Then a woman in Navy janitor coveralls stepped forward, mop bucket still at her feet. "I can fly it," she said calmly. The room fell silent. Charles Verrett, his back still turned to her, froze. The investors glanced nervously at each other. Delphine's words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to the world that had so often overlooked her. Charles slowly turned toward her, his lips curling into a smirk of disbelief. "You?" he scoffed. "The janitor?" His laughter rang out, echoing through the hangar. "Fly this jet and I'll marry you." But what happened next drained the color from his face. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Now, let's continue. The golden hour sun cast soft amber light across Miami Executive Airport, transforming the private hangar into a cathedral of shadows and gleaming metal. Delphine McCool pushed her maintenance cart along the polished concrete floor, the wheels squeaking in a rhythm she'd come to know by heart over 5 long years. Her Navy coveralls bore the Verrett Aviation logo, the same company whose executives looked through her as if she were made of glass. She paused to adjust the cleaning supplies on her cart, watching Charles Verrett hold court near the Gulfstream G650. The billionaire CEO stood like a man who believed he owned not just the jet beside him, but the very air that filled the hangar. His tailored suit remained impossibly crisp despite the Florida humidity, his presence commanding attention from the 3 Asian investors who flanked him. "Gentlemen, this aircraft represents the crown jewel of our fleet," Verrett said, his voice carrying across the space. "In 90 minutes, we'll be in Atlanta finalizing a deal that will make Verrett Aviation the premier private carrier in the Southeast." Delphine had heard variations of this speech countless times. She'd cleaned up after these meetings, emptied the trash cans full of champagne bottles when deals closed, mopped the floors where fortunes were made and lost. Today should have been no different, except something in the air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. She maneuvered her cart carefully, trying to navigate around the group without drawing attention. But as she passed, her cart clipped a power cable, the metallic clang echoing through the hangar. Verrett's head snapped toward her, his piercing blue eyes narrowing with irritation. "The help should know their place," he said, not quite under his breath, the words pitched to carry to his audience. "This is a business meeting, not a janitor's convention." The investors shifted uncomfortably. One studied his phone with sudden interest. Another cleared his throat. But none spoke up. Delphine's hands tightened on the cart handle until her knuckles ached. 5 years she'd endured comments like this. 5 years of being invisible, of being less than human in their eyes. The old Delphine, Captain McCool, who'd commanded respect at 30,000 feet, would have responded differently. But that woman had been grounded by grief, by a tragedy that still haunted her dreams. "My apologies, Mr. Verrett," she said, her voice steady as steel despite the fire burning in her chest. She'd barely taken 3 steps when chaos erupted. Harrison, Verrett's personal pilot, suddenly clutched his stomach and doubled over near the aircraft stairs, his face drained of color as he stumbled, catching himself against the jet's hull. "Harrison?" Verrett's assistant rushed forward, her heels clicking frantically against the floor. "Food poisoning!" Harrison gasped, sweat beading on his forehead. "That seafood lunch, I can't. I can barely stand, let alone fly." The hangar fell silent except for Harrison's labored breathing and the distant hum of aircraft on nearby runways. Delphine watched Verrett's face cycle through emotions. Confusion, anger, then something close to panic. "Get me another pilot," he barked at his assistant. "Now!" The assistant's fingers flew across her phone screen, her voice growing more desperate with each call. "Jenkins is in Orlando. Patterson's in Houston. Rodriguez is on vacation. Sir." The nearest available pilot is 3 hours away. 3 hours? Verrett's composure cracked like ice under pressure. The meeting is in 90 minutes. If we're not there, this deal dies. $2.8 billion. The number seemed to hang in the air, heavy as storm clouds. The investors began speaking rapidly in Mandarin, their tone suggesting concern. Delphine set down her mop bucket. The sound rang through the hangar like a bell. I can fly it. Every head turned toward her. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Verrett's expression shifted from shock to disbelief, finally settling on contempt. You? His laugh was sharp, cutting. The janitor? He circled her slowly, taking in her stained coveralls, her work boots, the ID badge that simply read, Maintenance Staff. The investors watched with confusion. His assistant pressed her lips together, suppressing either a laugh or a gasp. You probably can't even spell Gulfstream, Verrett continued, playing to his audience. What makes you think you could fly a $70 million aircraft? I can fly your jet, Delphine repeated, stepping forward into the circle of light cast by the hangar's overhead lamps. Unless you'd prefer to lose your deal. Verrett's jaw clenched. He looked at his watch, then at his investors, then back at Delphine. His lips curved into something cruel. You know what? This is perfect. He turned to address everyone in the hangar, ground crew and all. Let's make this interesting. Fly this jet successfully, and I'll marry you. He paused for effect, his smile widening. That's what women like you want, isn't it? To land a rich husband? To go from pushing mops to pushing shopping carts on Rodeo Drive? Some of the ground crew looked away. Others stared in disbelief. The investors exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the turn of events. But when you fail, Verrett continued, and you will fail, you're fired. No severance, no reference. You'll never work at another airport in this state. Delphine held his gaze for a long moment, 5 years of silence finally reaching its breaking point. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the inner pocket of her coveralls and withdrew a small leather wallet, worn soft from years of handling. From it, she pulled a card she hadn't shown anyone since the day she'd taken this job. Her airline transport pilot license gleamed under the hangar lights. Current. Valid. With type ratings for multiple aircraft, including the Gulfstream G650. The smirk vanished from Verrett's face like smoke in wind. Without waiting for his response, Delphine walked toward the aircraft. Her work boots echoed against the concrete, each step measured and certain. She climbed the stairs and entered the cockpit, her hands finding familiar positions on controls she'd once known better than her own heartbeat. Behind her, she heard Verrett's assistant whisper urgently, Sir, should we stop her? Call security? No, Verrett said, his voice tight with something between rage and fear. Let her try. When she can't even start the engines, we'll all have a good laugh. But Delphine's fingers were already dancing across the overhead panel, beginning the startup sequence with the muscle memory of 8,000 flight hours. She was no longer the invisible janitor. She was Captain Delphine McCool, and she was about to remind everyone what that meant. The first engine spooled up with a rising whine that built to a satisfying roar. Then the second. The sound filled the hangar, drowning out everything else. Through the cockpit window, she saw Verrett's face, pale now with the dawning realization that he had gravely underestimated the woman he'd dismissed as the help. The investors were already boarding, their phones out, recording everything. This flight would change everything. But first, she had a jet to fly and a billionaire to humble. The engine's roar filled the cockpit as Delphine's hands moved across the controls with surgical precision. Each switch, each gauge, each indicator light was exactly where her muscle memory expected it to be. Through the windscreen, she could see Verrett and his investors boarding, their faces a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. But as she adjusted the pilot's seat and strapped in, Delphine wasn't in Miami anymore. She was back in Afghanistan, 5 years ago, the Hindu Kush Mountains rising like ancient teeth against a dawn sky. Phoenix 2, maintain altitude at Angels 30, Her voice had crackled through the radio that morning, confident and clear. Captain Delphine McCool, call sign Phoenix 1, leading a routine VIP transport mission. Her wingman, Major James Rocket Roberts, had laughed through the comm. Copy that, Phoenix 1. Another milk run for the diplomatic corps? Stay sharp, Rocket. These mountains don't forgive complacency. They'd flown together for 3 years. James had been more than her wingman. He'd been her brother in everything but blood. The only other black pilot in their squadron, he understood the weight they both carried, the need to be twice as good to get half the credit. He'd been there when she made history as the youngest black woman to achieve squadron commander. He'd stood beside her when generals pinned commendations to her dress blues. The mechanical failure had come without warning. One moment, Rocket's helicopter was flying in perfect formation. The next, his tail rotor assembly catastrophically failed. She watched, helpless, as his aircraft spiraled down into the valley below. His last words still haunted her dreams. Phoenix 1, tell my girls I love them. Delphine, pre-flight complete? Verrett's sharp voice through the cockpit door snapped her back to the present. Beginning taxi procedures, she responded, her professional tone giving nothing away. But her hands trembled slightly as she released the parking brake. 5 years since she'd sat in a cockpit with passengers depending on her. 5 years since she'd been responsible for lives other than her own. After Rocket's death, she'd tried to continue flying. The Air Force had cleared her of any fault. Mechanical failures happened. But every time she lifted off, she saw his helicopter spinning down, heard his voice, felt the weight of being the one who survived. The guilt ate at her like acid, dissolving her confidence from the inside out. Then came the second blow. 3 months after losing Rocket, she'd gotten the call while stationed at MacDill Air Force Base. Her partner Marcus and their 2-year-old daughter Zara had been hit by a drunk driver on Interstate 75. They'd died instantly, the Florida Highway Patrol told her, as if that somehow made it better. 2 devastating losses in 3 months. The universe had taken everyone she loved, everyone who mattered, while she remained untouched. The survivor's guilt crushed her beneath its weight. She'd submitted her resignation the next day, walking away from 8,000 flight hours, from commendations and achievements, from the only career she'd ever wanted. Tower, this is November 73 Alpha requesting clearance for taxi to runway 9 right. Delphine spoke into the radio, the professional phraseology returning like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. November 73 Alpha, cleared to taxi via taxiway Lima, hold short of runway 9 right. She'd found the janitor position at Verrett Aviation through a temp agency. No background check beyond the basics, no questions about her past. The night shift meant minimal human interaction. She could push her cart through empty hangars, be near the aircraft she still loved without having to fly them. It was penance and comfort, wrapped in Navy coveralls. For 5 years, she'd been a ghost haunting the periphery of the aviation world. She'd watched pilots prep for flights, overheard their stories in break rooms, secretly studied new avionics systems during her shifts. She'd maintained her licenses using her savings, taking recertification courses online, booking simulator time at a training facility 2 hours away where no one knew her. It was torture and therapy combined, keeping her skills sharp for a return she never thought would come. You actually know what you're doing. Verrett's voice came through the intercom, surprise evident despite his attempt to sound neutral. Delphine didn't respond. She was too busy monitoring engine parameters, checking hydraulic pressures, verifying flight control responses. The Gulfstream responded to her touch like a well-trained thoroughbred, powerful and eager. For the first time in 5 years, she felt the intoxicating mixture of responsibility and freedom that came with command of an aircraft. Tower, November 73 Alpha, holding short of runway 9 right, ready for departure. November 73 Alpha, cleared for takeoff, runway 9 right, fly heading 090, climb and maintain 5,000. As she advanced the throttles, Delphine thought about the ID badge in her pocket, the one that read simply, Maintenance Staff. She thought about the countless nights she'd mopped these hangar floors, invisible to men like Verrett who built their empires on the assumption that people like her didn't matter. She thought about Rocket, about Marcus and Zara, about the woman she used to be before grief grounded her. The Gulfstream accelerated down the runway, and at precisely the right moment, Delphine pulled back on the yoke. The aircraft lifted gracefully into the Florida sky, and for one perfect moment, the weight of 5 years fell away. She wasn't the janitor anymore. She wasn't the grieving survivor. She was Captain Delphine McCool, and she was exactly where she belonged. Behind her in the cabin, she heard Verrett's investors speaking excitedly in Mandarin, their phones out, recording everything. She knew this moment was being documented, that her revelation would soon be beyond anyone's control. Good. Let them see what happened when you underestimated someone based on their uniform. November 7-3 Alpha. Contact departure on 124.7. Switching to departure 124.7. November 7-3 Alpha. As Miami fell away below them and the Gulfstream climbed toward cruising altitude, Delphine felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Purpose. This wasn't just about flying Verrett's jet or proving him wrong. This was about reclaiming the pieces of herself she'd thought were lost forever. The afternoon sun painted the clouds gold as they climbed through 10,000 feet. Somewhere up here, among these clouds she'd once called home, Rocket was watching, Marcus and Zara too. And for the first time since losing them, Delphine didn't feel like she was betraying their memory by being alive. She was honoring it by being alive, and finally, truly, flying again. The Gulfstream climbed through 15,000 feet, and with each foot of altitude, Delphine felt more of her old self returning. She reached up to the overhead panel, adjusting the cabin pressure and temperature with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. Through the reinforced cockpit door, she could hear Charles Verrett pacing in the cabin, his Italian leather shoes drumming an anxious rhythm on the aircraft's plush carpet. Miami Center, November 7-3 Alpha, requesting flight level 350, she spoke into her headset, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had once commanded respect in military airspace. November 7-3 Alpha, cleared to flight level 350, no delays expected. She pulled back gently on the yoke, and the $70 million aircraft responded like an extension of her will. The Florida coastline fell away beneath them, the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly eastward, painted gold by the afternoon sun. For 5 years, she'd watched jets like this take off from the ground, their navigation lights blinking as they disappeared into clouds she could no longer touch. Now she was among them again, master of this aluminum cathedral climbing toward heaven. The cockpit door opened. Charles stood there, his frame filling the doorway, his face a battlefield where arrogance and awe waged war. His tie was loosened, his perfect composure cracking like drought-stricken earth. "How?" The word came out strained, as if pulled from somewhere deep in his chest. Delphine didn't turn around. Her hands remained steady on the controls, her eyes scanning the instruments in a practiced pattern that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. "How what, Mr. Verrett? How does a janitor know how to fly a Gulfstream?" "The same way a billionaire learns to underestimate people," she replied, adjusting the autopilot heading. "Practice." She heard him step closer, could smell his expensive cologne mixing with the distinct scent of pressurized cabin air. In the reflection of the windscreen, she watched him study the cockpit, taking in the complexity of controls she manipulated with casual expertise. The flight management system, the weather radar, the TKS display showing nearby traffic, all of it flowing through her consciousness like blood through veins. November 7-3 Alpha, contact Atlanta Center on 132.5. Atlanta Center on 132.5, November 7-3 Alpha. She switched frequencies with one hand while adjusting the engine parameters with the other, each movement precise and economical. "You're not just a pilot," Charles said, his voice quieter now, almost respectful. "The way you handle this aircraft, you're military trained." Delphine finally glanced back at him. His blue eyes, which had earlier blazed with contempt, now held something different. Not quite humility, but the dawning recognition of a catastrophic miscalculation. "Captain Delphine McCool, United States Air Force, retired," she said simply, then turned back to her instruments. 8,000 flight hours. 2,000 in Gulfstream specifically. I've flown generals, senators, foreign dignitaries. I've landed in sandstorms in Iraq and thunderstorms over the Pacific. This? She gestured at the calm skies ahead. This is a walk in the park. Behind Charles, she could see the investors pressed against the cabin windows, their phones capturing everything. One of them was live streaming, she realized. The modern world's instant jury, witnessing Charles Verrett's humiliation in real time. Why? Charles moved to the co-pilot's seat but didn't sit, as if the leather might burn him. Why were you cleaning my hangars? For a moment, Delphine considered telling him about Rocket, about Marcus and Zara, about the grief that had grounded her more effectively than any mechanical failure. But Charles Verrett hadn't earned that truth. He hadn't earned the privilege of understanding her pain. That's not your concern, she said instead. Your concern should be your meeting in Atlanta, which will reach in approximately 42 minutes. She engaged the weather radar, studying a line of storms building to the west. Without hesitation, she requested a deviation from Atlanta Center, navigating around the turbulence with the foresight that came from years of reading the sky's moods. The Gulf Stream banked gently left, smooth as silk, avoiding weather that would have bounced lesser pilots around like dice in a cup. Charles gripped the doorframe as the aircraft turned, though there was nothing violent about the maneuver. The way you flew out of Miami, the taxi, the takeoff, it was perfect. It was adequate, Delphine corrected. Perfection would have been achieving it without an audience recording my every move. She could feel his stare, the weight of his reevaluation. 5 years she'd endured his dismissive glances, his muttered comments, his assumption that the color of her skin and the uniform she wore defined her worth. Now he was seeing her, really seeing her, and the cognitive dissonance was almost visible on his face. The marriage comment, he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. Was recorded, Delphine finished for him. Along with your comment about the help knowing their place. Your investors have it all on video. I imagine it's already trending on social media. Through the windscreen, the Georgia landscape appeared, a patchwork quilt of green and brown stretching toward Atlanta's skyline. Delphine began the descent checklist, her hands moving with the same precision they'd shown at takeoff. She called Atlanta approach, received vectors for the ILS approach to runway 27, and began configuring the aircraft for landing. I could make you rich, Charles said suddenly, desperation creeping into his voice. Chief pilot, 6 figures, company car, whatever you want. Delphine laughed, a sound as sharp as breaking glass. Mr. Verrett, you just offered to marry me as a joke, as an insult. You've spent 5 years treating me as less than human. And now, because I can fly your jet, you want to buy my silence? She lowered the landing gear, the mechanical sound filling the cockpit with its reassuring rhythm. 3 green lights confirmed gear down and locked. The Atlanta skyline grew larger, Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport spreading before them like a concrete invitation. November 73 Alpha, cleared ILS runway 27 approach, maintain 170 knots until depot. Cleared ILS 27, maintaining 170 until depot, November 73 Alpha. Charles stood, his hand on the cockpit door handle, but he didn't leave. You're going to destroy me, aren't you? Delphine engaged the autopilot's approach mode, watching as the aircraft captured the localizer and glide slope, beginning its precise descent toward the runway. Only then did she turn to face him fully. Mr. Verrett, you destroyed yourself the moment you decided someone's worth was determined by their uniform. I'm just landing your plane. As the Gulf Stream descended through 2,000 feet, the runway lights beckoning like stars fallen to earth, Charles Verrett finally understood. He hadn't just underestimated a janitor. He'd underestimated Captain Delphine McCool, and that mistake would cost him everything. The Gulf Stream descended through 1,000 feet, Atlanta's runway stretching ahead like a promise. Delphine's hands remained steady on the yoke, her breathing controlled, even as 5 years of suppressed emotion threatened to overwhelm her. Through her headset, Atlanta Tower cleared them for landing, but she barely needed the confirmation. Every instinct, every hard-won hour of experience told her exactly where she was in space and time. 500 feet, she announced to no one in particular, following protocol even though she flew alone in the cockpit. The automated voice of the ground proximity warning system echoed her. 500! In the cabin behind her, silence had replaced the investor's excited chatter. She could feel Charles still hovering near the cockpit door, his presence like a storm cloud waiting to break. The weight of what was about to happen, the inevitable collision between his arrogance and her truth, filled the space between them like pressurized air. 100 feet. Her voice remained steady. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10. The main wheels kissed the runway with barely a whisper. The kind of landing pilots called a greaser, where passengers often didn't realize they'd touched down until the engines reversed. Delphine deployed the thrust reversers and applied the brakes with measured precision. The $70 million aircraft responding to her commands like a trained dancer following a partner's lead. November 7-3 Alpha, turn right at taxiway Delta, contact ground on 121.9. Right at Delta, ground on 121.9, November 7-3 Alpha. As she taxied toward the private terminal, Delphine caught sight of news vans already gathering. Someone had leaked the live stream. Of course they had. In the 21st century, humiliation traveled at the speed of light. She brought the aircraft to a stop at the designated parking spot, her hands moving through the shutdown checklist with the same precision she'd shown throughout the flight. Engines off, electrical systems to ground power, parking brake set. Each action was a small goodbye to the cockpit she'd never thought she'd see again. Charles appeared in the doorway as she removed her headset. His face had lost all color, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been fear. Delphine, he started, then stopped, seemingly realizing it was the first time he'd used her actual name. About what I said earlier. She stood, turning to face him fully in the cramped cockpit space. 5 years of cleaning his jets, 5 years of invisibility, 5 years of minimum wage while he built his billions. All of it had led to this moment. You mean your proposal? She kept her voice level, professional. The one where you offered to marry me if I could fly this jet? The one designed to humiliate me in front of your investors? I didn't mean... Yes, you did. She stepped past him into the cabin where the investors sat with their phones still recording. You meant every word. You thought it was safe to mock me because you believed I was beneath you. Just the help, as you so eloquently put it. One of the investors cleared his throat. Ms. McCool, that was extraordinary flying. She nodded at him, but kept her attention on Charles. Mr. Verrett, to formally answer your proposal, I decline. I don't need to marry you or anyone else for success. I've already achieved more than you can imagine, and I did it on my own merit. Charles's assistant had opened the main cabin door, and the sound of reporters shouting questions drifted up from the tarmac. The situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control, and everyone in the cabin knew it. However, Delphine continued, reaching into her coveralls to pull out her Verrett Aviation ID badge, I do accept your other offer, the one about being fired. She dropped the badge on the leather seat. Consider this my resignation, effective immediately. You can't just... Charles started. I can, and I am. She moved toward the cabin door, but turned back one more time. Oh, and Mr. Verrett? My attorney will be in contact regarding the hostile work environment I've endured for the past 5 years. We have extensive documentation, including today's events, which your investors so helpfully recorded. The lead investor, an older man with silver hair, stood up. Ms. McCool, would you consider flying for our company? We could use someone with your skills and character. Charles's face went from pale to crimson. You can't poach my pilot during my own business meeting. She just resigned, the investor pointed out calmly. And after what we've witnessed, I think we need to reconsider this entire merger. A CEO who treats employees this way, who makes such catastrophic judgment errors. It raises concerns about leadership and corporate culture. Delphine descended the aircraft stairs into the Georgia afternoon. the humid air hitting her like a wall after the controlled environment of the cockpit. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, questions flying like bullets. "Captain McCool, is it true you were working as a janitor? Will you be pressing charges? What made you reveal your identity today?" She raised her hand for silence, and surprisingly, they gave it to her. 5 years of hiding had ended, and she found she had words that needed saying. "For 5 years, I've cleaned aircraft at Verret Aviation while maintaining my pilot certifications. I'm not the only overqualified person working jobs beneath their capability. We do it for many reasons: trauma, circumstances, systemic barriers. What happened today shouldn't have been necessary to prove my worth." Behind her, she heard Charles exit the aircraft, trying to push through the crowd. His investors remained on the jet, their expressions unreadable but their phones still out. "Mr. Verret made assumptions about me based on my appearance, my job, my race, and my gender. Those assumptions have now cost him dearly. Let this be a lesson. Talent doesn't always come in the packages you expect." A reporter shouted, "What will you do now?" For the first time in 5 years, Delphine smiled genuinely. "I'm going to fly again, on my own terms." She walked away from the aircraft, from Charles Verret's sputtering attempts at damage control, from 5 years of hiding in plain sight. The afternoon sun was bright on her face, and somewhere above, she could hear another jet climbing into the sky. Soon, she promised herself, she'd be up there again. But first, she had a hostile work environment lawsuit to file and job offers to consider. The aviation world had just been reminded that Captain Delphine McCool existed, and she intended to make sure they never forgot it again. Behind her, Charles's empire began its descent, as inevitable as gravity, as precise as her landing. She'd given him the chance to see her as human, as capable, as equal. He'd chosen mockery instead. Now he would live with the consequences, broadcast to the world at 30 frames per second. Delphine sat in her small apartment in Hialeah, watching her phone light up like a slot machine. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to move from the worn couch where she'd collapsed after taking an Uber home from Atlanta. Still in her navy coveralls, she watched herself on the television screen for the 100th time, landing Charles Verret's jet with a precision that made aviation experts weep with appreciation. "Breaking news continues tonight," the CNN anchor announced. The video of Captain Delphine McCool, who worked as a janitor for 5 years before revealing herself as a decorated Air Force pilot, has now been viewed over 50 million times worldwide. Charles Verret's stock has plummeted 18% in after-hours trading. Her phone buzzed again. Another job offer. This one from NetJets, promising a senior captain position with a signing bonus that would have taken her 20 years to earn pushing mop buckets. She added it to the pile with the others. Delta's private jet division, FlexJet, even an offer from the CEO of a tech startup who wanted his own personal pilot. Each one more lucrative than the last, each one requiring an answer she wasn't sure she could give. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with the weight of sudden visibility. For 5 years, she'd been invisible, and there had been a strange comfort in that anonymity. Now her face was everywhere, her story dissected by talking heads who knew nothing about the nights she'd spent crying in airport bathroom stalls, fighting panic attacks triggered by the sound of helicopter rotors. Her laptop chimed with an email from her attorney, Jessica Chen, who'd taken her case pro bono after seeing the video. "Delphine, 3 more Verret Aviation employees have come forward with discrimination complaints. We're building a class action. Also, Charles Verret's team has reached out about a settlement. 7 figures to make this go away. Call me." 7 figures. Enough money to never work again. Enough to disappear properly this time? Maybe buy a little house somewhere quiet where the sound of aircraft engines didn't constantly remind her of everything she'd lost and found and lost again. But then what? Another 5 years of hiding, just with better furniture? She picked up the framed photo on her coffee table, the one she looked at every night before bed. Marcus and Zara, taken just weeks before the accident. Her daughter's smile was pure sunshine, her tiny hands reaching toward the camera. Marcus stood behind her, his arms protective, his eyes full of love for the family they'd built together. "What would you want me to do?" she asked the photo, as she did most nights. The answer came not from the photograph, but from her phone. A text from an unknown number with a military area code. "Captain McCool, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, currently commanding the 89th Airlift Squadron. I was Rocket's student at flight school. Heard you're flying again. He'd be proud. If you need to talk, I'm here." Delphine stared at the message until her eyes burned. Rocket would be proud. Would he, though? Or would he tell her she was being reckless, returning to a world that had already taken so much from her? The news had shifted to showing Charles Verrett's press conference from an hour ago. He stood at a podium, his usually perfect appearance disheveled, reading from prepared notes. "I deeply regret my words and actions toward Ms. McCool. I'm taking a leave of absence to reflect on my leadership style and will be undergoing sensitivity training." She turned off the television. His apology meant nothing. It was damage control, written by lawyers and public relations experts. The real Charles Verrett was the one who'd sneered at her for 5 years, who'd only seen her worth when she held his $70 million aircraft in her hands. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her therapist, Dr. Patricia Williams, whom she'd been seeing since leaving the military. "I saw the news," Dr. Williams said without preamble. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," Delphine admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. "I flew again. Really flew. And it felt right. Like coming home. But also terrifying." "That's perfectly normal. You've just taken a massive step. The question is, what do you want to do next?" Delphine walked to her window, looking out at the Miami skyline. In the distance, she could see planes taking off from the airport, their lights blinking as they climbed into the darkening sky. For 5 years, she'd watched them from the ground. Today, she'd been among them. "Everyone wants to hire me now," she said. "Not because they suddenly discovered my qualifications, but because I'm famous. Because hiring me makes them look progressive and forward-thinking. Is that necessarily bad? Sometimes the door opens for the wrong reasons, but once you're inside, you can prove yourself for the right ones." After ending the call, Delphine opened her laptop and began researching each job offer more carefully. Not just the salary and benefits, but the company culture, their safety records, their treatment of employees. If she was going to return to flying, it would be on her terms. Her phone buzzed with another text, this one from a reporter at the Washington Post. "Captain McCool, we'd like to feature you in our series on hidden talent in America's workforce. Your story could inspire others who are underemployed due to discrimination or circumstance." She thought about all the other janitors, security guards, and food service workers she'd met over the years, who had engineering degrees from their home countries, who spoke multiple languages, who had skills that America refused to recognize because of paperwork or prejudice or pure ignorance. Maybe that was the answer. Not just flying for herself, but flying as proof that talent existed everywhere, in every uniform, in every skin color, in every accent. She could be visible not for fame, but for purpose. Delphine picked up her phone and scrolled to Jessica Chen's number. "Tell Verrett's team no settlement with an NDA. I want a public trial. And set up meetings with the top 3 job offers. It's time Captain McCool returned to the skies." As she hung up, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 5 years. Anticipation for tomorrow. The trauma hadn't disappeared, might never fully fade, but it no longer owned her future. Outside her window, another plane climbed into the night sky, its lights disappearing into the clouds. Soon, she thought. Soon she'd be up there again. But this time carrying not just passengers, but the hopes of everyone who'd been overlooked, underestimated, and unseen. Charles Verrett stood in his empty boardroom at 3 in the morning, watching the city lights of Miami twinkle below through floor-to-ceiling windows that had once made him feel powerful. Now, they just made him feel exposed. The conference table where he'd closed billion-dollar deals reflected his haggard face, distorted and unfamiliar. He hadn't slept in 48 hours, hadn't been home in 3 days. The office that had been his kingdom now felt like a prison. On his laptop screen, the video played again. He'd watched it obsessively, frame by frame, trying to understand how he'd been so catastrophically wrong. There was Delphine, handling his Gulfstream with a mastery that made his regular pilots look like amateurs. The landing in Atlanta was artwork, pure precision meeting grace. The comments below the video were less kind to him. Classic example of corporate racism. This is why we need diversity in leadership. Verret aviation stock is going to tank, and he deserves it. His phone buzzed. Another board member calling. He let it go to voicemail, adding it to the 23 others he hadn't returned. The merger with the Hong Kong investors was dead. They'd pulled out within hours of landing, citing concerns about corporate culture and leadership judgment. 3 major clients had already indicated they were reviewing their contracts. His empire, built over 15 years of ruthless ambition, was crumbling in 15 hours. But it wasn't the financial losses keeping him awake. It was the memory of Delphine's eyes when she'd dropped her ID badge on the leather seat. Not angry, not vindictive, just disappointed. As if she'd expected nothing better from him, and he'd lived down to her expectations. Charles walked to his private bar, poured himself a scotch, then set it down untouched. Alcohol wouldn't fix this. Nothing would fix this. He thought about his ex-wife, Patricia, who'd left him 5 years ago. "You don't see people anymore, Charles," she'd said. "You only see assets or obstacles." He'd dismissed her words then, too focused on the next acquisition, the next quarter's profits. Now, standing in his empty office at an ungodly hour, he finally understood what she meant. Delphine McCool hadn't been a person to him. She'd been part of the background, like the furniture or the carpet. How many others had he overlooked? How many brilliant minds had he dismissed because they wore the wrong uniform? His laptop chimed with a new email. His assistant had forwarded him Delphine's service record, which had been leaked online by military aviation enthusiasts. He read through her commendations, her accomplishments, the glowing recommendations from generals and diplomats. She'd been trusted with the lives of the most powerful people in the country. She'd flown in combat zones where one mistake meant death. And he told her she couldn't spell Gulfstream. The shame was physical, burning in his chest like acid. He'd built his success on claiming to recognize talent, on making smart decisions about people. Yet he'd had one of the finest pilots in the country mopping his floors for 5 years and never noticed. What did that say about his judgment? What did that say about him as a human being? Charles pulled up his company's employee database, looking at it with new eyes. How many other Delphines were there? How many people had he hired for minimum wage jobs without ever wondering about their stories, their capabilities, their dreams? The janitor who always worked nights. Did he have a family? The security guard who spoke with an accent. What had she done before coming to America? He didn't know. He'd never asked. They'd been invisible to him. His phone rang again. This time, it was his mother calling from her retirement community in Sarasota. He almost didn't answer, but she'd keep calling until he did. "Charles Anthony Verret," she said, using his full name like she had when he was a child in trouble. "I just saw the news. How could you? Mom, That poor woman. Working for you for 5 years and you never saw her worth? I didn't raise you to be this kind of man." "I know." The words came out broken. "I know, Mom. Your father would be ashamed. He started that company with respect for every worker, from the pilots to the people who cleaned the planes. When did you forget that?" After she hung up, Charles sat in his leather chair, the one he'd imported from Italy because it cost more than most people's cars. Everything in his office was designed to project power, success, superiority. But what was it all worth if he'd lost his basic humanity in the process? He thought about Delphine's final words to him. Talent doesn't always come in the packages you expect. She hadn't just been talking about aviation skills. She'd been talking about human worth, about the danger of assumptions, about the blindness that comes with privilege. Charles opened a new email and began typing a letter to his board. Not the carefully crafted apology his PR team had written, but something real. He admitted his failures, not just with Delphine, but with the corporate culture he'd created. He announced he would step down as CEO, keeping only a minority stake in the company. The money from his divested shares would go toward establishing a scholarship fund for underrepresented pilots and aviation workers. It wouldn't fix what he'd done. It wouldn't undo 5 years of treating Delphine McCool as less than human. But maybe it was a start. As the sun began to rise over Miami, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Charles watched a plane take off from the airport in the distance. He wondered if Delphine was flying again, commanding another aircraft with the skill and grace he'd been too blind to see. She'd talked about trauma, about loss, about hiding from something that had broken her. Yet she'd still found the courage to step forward when it mattered. He'd had every advantage in life, every opportunity, and what had he done with it? Built walls of arrogance so high he couldn't see the people on the other side. Charles sent the email to the board, then began packing his office. The scotch remained untouched on the bar. The leather chair would go to whoever replaced him. The view from the windows would inspire someone else's ambition. As for him, he needed to learn how to see people again. Really see them. It was a lesson Delphine McCool had taught him at 35,000 feet, one that had cost him everything to learn. But perhaps, he thought as he placed his father's picture in a box, some lessons were worth the price. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the landing that changed everything. Delphine was in the middle of a Zoom interview with Emirates Airlines when her personal phone lit up with a number she knew by heart. Verret Aviation's executive line. She excused herself from the interview, staring at the phone as it rang. On the 4th ring, she answered, "Ms. McCool?" The voice wasn't Charles's assistant. It was Charles himself, and he sounded nothing like the arrogant CEO she'd known for 5 years. "It's Charles Verret. Please don't hang up." Delphine moved to her window, watching the morning traffic below. "You have 2 minutes. I'm calling to offer you a position. Senior captain, full benefits, your choice of routes, a salary that reflects your actual qualifications." He paused. "And a formal public apology from me, in whatever forum you choose." The silence stretched between them. Delphine could hear him breathing, waiting. The old Charles would have filled the quiet with more talking, more persuasion. This restraint was new. "You're offering me a job at the company where you humiliated me, where you and your staff treated me as subhuman for 5 years. Why would I even consider that?" "Because I was wrong." The words came out raw, unpolished. "Because I've spent 2 weeks examining every assumption I've ever made about people, and I found them all wanting. Because my father built that company with respect for every worker and I corrupted his legacy. I want to fix that, but I need help. Your help." Delphine sat down on her couch, the same spot where she'd watched herself become famous. "You need my help to save your company's reputation." "No, my reputation is beyond saving, and I've accepted that. I've already announced my resignation as CEO, effective once we find a replacement. But the company employs 300 people who had nothing to do with my failures. They deserve better leadership, and you deserve the chance to fly with the respect you should have had from day one." Through her laptop screen, she could see the Emirates interviewer waiting patiently. A position with them would mean relocating to Dubai, leaving everything behind, starting completely fresh. Part of her wanted that clean break, that distance from everything that had happened. "I've liquidated my personal stake in the company," Charles continued. $20 million is going into a foundation for underrepresented aviation professionals. The board has agreed to a complete restructuring of our corporate culture, with an external diversity consultant overseeing the changes. I won't be your boss. I won't even be in the building most days. What makes you think the other employees would accept me? They laughed when you mocked me. They watched me clean their offices for 5 years without seeing me. Some did, yes, and several have already resigned in shame. Others have reached out to the board, expressing support for you and sharing their own experiences with the toxic culture I created. Maria, from accounting, she told us she has a master's degree from the University of Havana. Tom from security was a police chief in Detroit before his department was defunded. People I never bothered to know. Delphine closed her eyes. She thought about Maria, who always smiled when they passed in the halls. Tom, who'd shared his lunch with her once when she'd forgotten hers. Good people trapped in the same invisible cage she'd been in. The new CEO, when we hire them, will report to a board that's been restructured, Charles said. 40% diverse membership now, including Captain Sarah Mitchell from the Air Force. She spoke very highly of you, said you were the finest pilot she'd ever known. Sarah Mitchell, Rocket's student. The threads of her past and future were tangling together in ways she hadn't expected. I need time to think, Delphine said. Of course. Take all the time I have conditions. She stood up, pacing now. First, I want hiring authority for all pilot positions. Second, I want a mandate to recruit from underrepresented communities. Third, the foundation you're creating. I want a seat on its board. Done. All of it. I'm not finished. I want a formal investigation into discriminatory practices, not just from you but throughout the company. Anyone found guilty of harassment or discrimination goes, no golden parachutes. Agreed. And I want it all in writing, reviewed by my attorney before I'll even consider meeting with you. I'll have legal draft it today. Delphine returned to her laptop, where the Emirates interviewer was still waiting. I need to go. Send the documents to my attorney, Jessica Chen. Ms. McCool, Delphine, wait. Charles's voice cracked slightly. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. But I want you to know that you've changed more than just my company. You've changed me. Forced me to see the man I'd become. And I didn't like what I saw. Change is easy to promise, Mr. Verrett. Living it is harder. I know. That's why I need people like you to hold me accountable. After she hung up, Delphine stared at the phone for a long moment. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was a mistake. Returning to Verrett Aviation would mean facing the ghosts of 5 years of humiliation. It would mean working in the same hangars where she'd been invisible, flying the same jets she'd cleaned. But it would also mean something else. It would mean reclaiming those spaces on her own terms. It would mean opening doors for others who'd been shut out. It would mean turning her pain into purpose. She returned to her laptop and apologized to the Emirates interviewer for the interruption. As she continued answering their questions, her mind was already elsewhere, imagining a different future. One where she walked into Verrett Aviation not as a janitor, or even just as a pilot, but as a leader. Where she could look Charles Verrett in the eye as an equal, or perhaps even as someone he'd have to look up to. The interview ended with Emirates offering her the position on the spot. She asked for a week to decide, knowing she was really asking for time to decide between running away and standing her ground. That night, she called Dr. Williams and talked for 2 hours about forgiveness. Not for Charles, but for herself. About whether returning to the place of her humiliation was strength or self-punishment. About whether she was ready to be the symbol and leader others needed her to be. What would Captain McCool do? Dr. Williams asked. Not the janitor who hid for 5 years, but the decorated pilot who flew into combat zones? Delphine knew the answer. Captain McCool would take the mission, no matter how dangerous, if it meant protecting others and completing the objective. The question was whether she was ready to be Captain McCool again, fully and completely, without hiding behind any uniform except her own wings. The meeting was set for neutral ground, a quiet cafe in Coral Gables, far from both Verrett Aviation and the spotlight that had followed Delphine for 3 weeks. She arrived early, choosing a corner table where she could see the door. Old habits from military training died hard. Always know your exits. Always control your position. Charles entered 5 minutes before their scheduled time, and Delphine barely recognized him. Gone was the perfectly styled hair, the $1,000 tie, the armor of corporate power. He wore simple khakis and a polo shirt, and carried himself with something she'd never seen in him before: humility. He stopped at her table, waiting. "May I sit?" She nodded, studying him as he pulled out the chair. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the table. This wasn't the same man who'd ruled his hangar like a king. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he began. I'm here to discuss business, Mr. Verrett. Nothing more. Of course. He pulled out a folder, thick with documents. Everything you requested is here. Hiring authority, recruitment mandate, board position on the foundation. The investigation into discriminatory practices has already begun. 7 employees have been terminated so far. Delphine reviewed the papers while Charles sat in silence. Her attorney had already vetted them, but she wanted to see them herself. Everything she'd demanded was there, plus more. A salary that made her Emirates offer look modest. A budget for developing a diversity pipeline program. Even a provision for her to choose her own team. This is comprehensive, she said finally. It's necessary. The company needs fundamental change, not cosmetic fixes. He paused, then added, I've been seeing a therapist, Dr. James Crawford. He specializes in corporate executives who've lost their way. First session, he asked me to name 5 janitors from my buildings. I couldn't name one. Delphine set down the papers. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know this isn't a performance. The man who mocked you, who couldn't see your worth, I'm trying to kill him. But it's harder than I thought. 20 years of believing success meant superiority doesn't disappear overnight. A server appeared with coffee. Delphine noticed Charles waited for her to order first. Another small change from the man who'd always assumed he came first. I've been talking to the other employees you mentioned, Delphine said. Maria, Tom, others. They're skeptical about these changes. They should be. I gave them no reason to trust me. Charles stared at his untouched coffee. My ex-wife called after seeing the news. She said she wasn't surprised, said I'd been building toward this moment for years, treating people like chess pieces instead of humans. And you think hiring me fixes that? No. His response was immediate. Hiring you is just the beginning. You'll have real authority to make changes. The new CEO, when we find them, will answer to a board that includes you. Your voice won't just be heard, it'll be decisive. Delphine thought about the past 3 weeks. The job offers, the interviews, the endless possibilities. She could go anywhere, do anything. But running away felt too much like those 5 years of hiding, just in a different uniform. I have additional conditions, she said. Charles pulled out a pen. I'm listening. First, I want Marcus Roberts. He's a black pilot with 15 years experience who's been repeatedly passed over for promotion at Delta's private division. I want him as my deputy. Done. Second, the hangar where you humiliated me, I want it converted into a training facility for the diversity program. Every new hire will learn in the space where the old culture died. Charles's hand stilled for a moment, then he wrote it down. Appropriate. Third, you and I will never be friends. This is a professional relationship only. You've caused me too much pain for anything else. I understand. Do you? Delphine leaned forward. Because in your world, everything is transactional. You think enough money, enough apologies, enough changes will balance the ledger. But some things can't be bought back. The 5 years I spent hiding, the dignity you stripped away, the assumptions you made about my worth, those are permanent. Charles set down his pen. For the first time since she'd known him, his eyes were genuinely vulnerable. You're right. I keep thinking in terms of deals and negotiations. Even now, trying to make amends, I'm still that person. Maybe I'll always be that person. Maybe. But the company doesn't have to be. That's why I'm considering this. She thought about Captain Mitchell's message, about the pilots of color watching her story, about Maria and Tom, and all the invisible talent waiting for someone to see them. This wasn't about forgiving Charles Verrett. It was about something bigger. I'll take the position, she said finally. But I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for everyone who's been overlooked, underestimated, and ignored. For every janitor with a degree, every security guard with a story, every person whose talents are hidden by someone else's assumptions. Charles nodded. I know. I start Monday. Full authority as outlined. Marcus Roberts comes with me. The investigation continues regardless of whom it implicates. Agreed. Delphine stood, gathering the documents. One more thing. That marriage proposal you made as a joke? I wanted on record that it was workplace harassment. Not for legal action, but for training purposes. Every new executive will hear that story as an example of how not to treat employees. Charles's face reddened, but he nodded. It should be documented. All of it. As she turned to leave, he spoke once more. Captain McCool, for what it's worth, you're the best pilot I've ever seen. The way you flew that day, it was art. She paused at the door. I know. That's the difference between us, Mr. Verrett. I never needed you to tell me my worth. I always knew it. Walking to her car, Delphine felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She was returning to Verrett Aviation, but not as the hidden janitor, or even just as a pilot. She was returning as a leader, a change-maker, someone who could transform the culture that had tried to diminish her. Monday would begin a new chapter. Not a setback, but a reclamation. Captain Delphine McCool was taking control, and this time, everyone would see her coming. 6 months later, Delphine stood in the transformed hangar at Miami Executive Airport, watching her first class of diversity pipeline recruits perform their pre-flight checks. The space that had once witnessed her humiliation now echoed with the voices of 20 aspiring pilots from backgrounds as varied as their dreams. Marcus Roberts, her deputy, guided a young Haitian-American woman through the cockpit procedures of a Cessna 172, his patience evident in every instruction. Captain McCool, the board meeting starts in 15 minutes, her assistant, formerly one of the ground crew who'd witnessed that fateful day, reminded her. Tell them I'll be there in 10, Sandra. I want to see Keisha complete her first solo taxi. The hangar had been completely renovated. Where mop buckets once stood, flight simulators now hummed with activity. The walls displayed photos of aviation pioneers, Bessie Coleman, Eugene Bullard, the Tuskegee Airmen, people whose excellence had persevered despite obstacles. In the center, a plaque read, Excellence has no uniform, the Delphine McCool Training Center. Charles had insisted on the name over her objections. It was one of the few battles she'd let him win. As Keisha successfully completed her taxi, Delphine headed to the executive conference room. The same room where she'd once emptied trash cans now held her nameplate at the table. Captain Delphine McCool, Chief Pilot and Director of Diversity Initiatives. The new CEO, Patricia Yamamoto, a former Navy pilot with a reputation for transformative leadership, nodded as Delphine entered. Perfect timing, Charles just dialed in from Seattle. On the video screen, Charles appeared from his new office at a nonprofit focused on workforce development. After stepping down from Verrett Aviation, he'd moved across the country, putting distance between himself and his old life. He looked healthier than she'd ever seen him. The stress lines softened. The armored expression replaced by something more genuine. Good morning, Captain McCool, he said formally. They'd maintained professional boundaries, speaking only during board meetings and official communications. Mr. Verrett, she acknowledged. Patricia led the meeting, reviewing quarterly reports. Verrett Aviation's transformation had been painful but necessary. They'd lost some old clients who couldn't adapt to the cultural changes, but gained new ones attracted by their commitment to diversity and excellence. The company was leaner but stronger, its reputation rebuilt on actual values rather than hollow prestige. The diversity pipeline program has exceeded projections, Patricia announced. Captain McCool's recruits have a 92% completion rate, with 3 already hired by major carriers. Delphine felt pride warm her chest. Each success story vindicated not just her program, but her decision to stay and fight rather than run. Charles, your foundation has approved funding for 10 more scholarship positions, Patricia continued. Any comments? Charles cleared his throat. Only that the foundation board, particularly Captain McCool, deserves credit for the selection process. We're finding exceptional talent that traditional channels overlooked. After the meeting, Delphine returned to the hangar to find a celebration in progress. Keisha had passed her first solo flight, tears of joy streaming down her face as her classmates surrounded her with congratulations. Maria from accounting was there too, having enrolled in night classes to convert her Cuban credentials to U.S. standards. Tom, the former police chief, now served as the program's security and logistics coordinator, his experience invaluable in managing the complex operation. "Captain McCool!" Keisha ran over, still glowing with achievement. "I did it! I actually flew alone!" "You did more than that," Delphine told her. "You proved that talent exists everywhere, waiting for opportunity." Her phone buzzed with a text from Charles. "Saw the video of Keisha's solo on the program's social media? Remarkable. The girl you recruited from the grocery store?" "Cashier with an aerospace engineering degree from Haiti," Delphine replied. "She just needed someone to see past the uniform." 3 dots appeared, showing he was typing, then stopped, then started again. Finally, "I see it now. What I missed for so many years. Thank you for teaching me to look." Delphine didn't respond. Some conversations were better left incomplete. Some bridges, better left partially built. Their relationship would never be friendship, but it had evolved into something functional. Mutual respect, born from painful growth. That evening, Delphine stood on the tarmac as the sun set, the same golden hour light that had illuminated her humiliation, now blessing her triumph. A Gulfstream G650, not Verrett's, but one belonging to the program, sat ready for tomorrow's training flight. She would take Marcus and 3 advanced students up, showing them the complexities of jet aviation. She thought about Rocket, about Marcus and Zara, about the 5 years she'd spent hiding. The pain hadn't disappeared, it never would, but it had transformed into something useful. Every student who passed through her program carried a piece of her story, proof that excellence could emerge from anywhere, that assumptions were dangerous, that talent didn't always arrive in expected packages. Sandra approached with tomorrow's schedule. "You have the morning training flight, lunch with the Aviation Diversity Council, and Senator Harrison wants to discuss federal funding for programs like ours." "The senator who called for congressional hearings on workplace discrimination after my story broke?" "The same. She says you've inspired legislation." Delphine nodded, accepting the schedule. Her life had become fuller than she'd ever imagined during those long nights pushing a mop. She was flying again, but more than that, she was lifting others with her. As she walked to her car, no longer an old sedan but a modest SUV suitable for transporting equipment and students, her phone rang. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell calling from Washington. "Delphine, I wanted you to know. We're naming the new training facility at MacDill after Rocket. The James Roberts Center for Aviation Excellence. The dedication is next month. Will you speak?" "I'll be there," Delphine promised, her throat tight with emotion. After the call, she sat in her car for a moment, looking back at the hangar. Through the windows, she could see her students still celebrating, their futures bright with possibility. Charles Verrett had tried to clip her wings with his mockery, his proposed marriage as an insult. Instead, he'd freed her to soar higher than either of them could have imagined. Captain Delphine McCool started her engine and drove toward tomorrow, where more students waited, more barriers needed breaking, and more skies beckoned. She wasn't just flying anymore. She was teaching others to fly, proving every day that the sky belonged to everyone brave enough to claim it. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her limits. She had reclaimed her wings, and with them, she was lifting the world,